And I'm so pleased that the ROM is presenting the wonderful Vikings exhibition. It brings to life a storied culture, a storied history in ways that will be so meaningful for our visitors. It also brings forward new scholarship and new understanding, so rather than having a somewhat distorted view of the myths of Vikings, we could actually learn who these people were, as a people that not only were warriors, but also were farmers and fishermen, people who not only were involved in pillaging, but also were inventors and people who cared about the way they presented themselves to the world, just as we do today. So this is very much the kind of show that the ROM wants to bring to you and everybody here in Canada.
The exhibition has about 8 different sections. These start by just basically challenging the visitors to ask them who they think the Vikings are. There's several sections on everyday life in Viking society and living in a house in Viking society. And then we move on to Viking spirituality. We move on to death and burial practices. And then we move on to over the sea, which is moving out into the rest of the world and expanding the Viking world. And that dovetails nicely with our own ROM original content, which has to do with the Vikings here in Canada and explores the archaeology of the Vikings here in northeastern Canada.
The ROM is so pleased also to acknowledge the Swedish History Museum and museum partners that developed this exhibition, and then of course our own wonderful curators who added the Canadian section that looks at Viking settlements here in Canada. And I'd also like to acknowledge Raymond James, who's responsible for presenting this exhibition here at the museum, and Volvo that also helped make this project possible.
We have a collection of artifacts that were collected from a very elite Viking warrior grave in a place called Birka, Sweden. And these objects have been in the news recently because in September, a group of scientists tested the skeleton that was associated with these objects, and they found that the skeleton seems to be a female. Not everyone completely accepts that interpretation, but the debate goes on, so you can actually come and look at these objects and think through some of this cutting-edge research and really decide for yourself what you think. So these could relate to the first ever archaeological example of a female Viking warrior. This is called our ghost ship installation, and as you see, there's about 200 iron rivets suspended from the ceiling here. And they're in the shape of a Viking boat burial. So this actually represents how an archaeologist would discover a Viking boat burial. Of course, there would be no wood left because it doesn't preserve, so it's just the iron that's left. And really the most important part about this is the relationship between the nails. And so when an archaeologist discovers something like this, all the air that you see here would be filled in with dirt because this would be mounded over the boat burial. And when archaeologists start to uncover these rivets, they use various mapping strategies to record the exact three-dimensional space where they find them. And then they can reconstruct how they found it in the ground. And if you move over here and look down this way, you'll see that it's the shape of a boat. So someone was once buried in this boat. It was a very important person laid to rest in a boat. So this is the original content that we've created for the ROM. So this is created by the ROM about the Vikings in Canada and explores the archaeology of when the Vikings came here about 1,000 years ago and settled and started to explore. And so there's a lot of different ideas about what the Vikings were doing here, but we base most of that off of the only firm archaeological site of the Vikings here in Newfoundland called L'Anse aux Meadows. And so here in this case, we see some artifacts from L'Anse aux Meadows. In fact, these two objects in particular are very interesting. This is one of the first objects ever found. It's a bronze cloak fastener recovered at L'Anse aux Meadows, and that basically shows that the Vikings were there. And some of these other objects explore possible evidence for the Vikings' interactions with various indigenous groups in the Arctic. And so overall what we're trying to do in this part of the exhibit is just show the realities of what the Vikings probably were doing here and how we actually know about that. So in this case is a very interesting artifact that we actually hold here at the ROM. It is called the Beardmore sword. It is a sword that is authentically of the Viking Age, most likely from Norway. And it was recovered, supposedly, from Beardmore near Thunder Bay, Ontario. And so in the 1930s, when this sword was brought here, we thought that actually this was evidence that the Vikings were in the Thunder Bay area. It turns out that it is a fraud. It actually was brought over from Norway, most likely in the 20th century, and someone made up the fact that they might have found it in the woods. They actually found it in their basement, it seems. So it's really important to not only show the realities of what the archaeology tells us, but to show that when there are frauds and forgeries, because this misrepresents Viking history, but it also infringes upon the very rich indigenous history of Canada. This is one of our interactives that up to 4 people can use at the same time. And as you can see, there's an outline of a ship here, and this actually represents doing the archaeology and excavating a Viking Age boat burial. And so you can use your hand to touch different parts and see what the archaeologist found in different areas. And you can also, we can restart, and you can actually start from the grass level and actually dig down. So there we are, we're digging from the grass, going into the dirt, and we're going to continue to dig until we find some artifacts, but that may take some more time, so we're just going to, like that. So people can actually come and experience how it was to excavate a Viking boat burial.
In addition to the exhibition itself, we have a full fall and into the spring program series where you'll get to hear from speakers, you'll get to eat food that is brought to you based on a Viking and Scandinavian theme, and otherwise really understand the context of this exhibition and the extraordinary people, the Vikings. So please stay tuned, look at our website, see what's available, and come take part not only in the exhibition itself, but also in a tremendous range of programming.
We're happy to invite you as visitors to come and explore the richness of Viking history and culture through these fabulous archaeological finds.